listening to the Hidden Killers podcast with Tony Brueski,
featuring former federal prosecutor and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Neama Rahmani.
Let's talk for a moment about all of the mounting evidence that has come up in this last year against Bryan Kohberger. Obviously, if we're getting that type of a match, like weeding out 99.9% of the population, that in itself seems like a very large slam dunk as far as at least connecting those two sources. Now, beyond that, it doesn't necessarily create someone who saw the crime being committed, but it does put some of his DNA at the actual crime scene itself. There's been arguments that there's other DNA out there that wasn't investigated, that wasn't looked into further, that was at the crime scene, which would make sense. It was kind of a party house. There'd be a lot of DNA there. The fact that this was on the knife sheath underneath the body, is that what makes it so much stronger than any of the other quote-unquote DNA that's out there in this house that keeps being thrown out by the defense of making that statement?
I think so, Tony. I mean, obviously, we've come a long way in the past 30 years with DNA. I remember OJ and the jurors thought it was essentially junk science. I mean, now everyone knows how reliable it is. And I mean, you're right. I mean, it's the key evidence that puts Bryan Kohberger at the scene, or at least his DNA at the scene. Now, we know his cell phone at least wasn't pinging off the towers at the time of the murder. The white Hyundai Elantra was caught on video, but there's a lot of white Hyundai Elantras, and there was no license plate. Whether the defense is going to argue that it was transferred or contaminated somehow, it's on the knife sheath. We don't have the murder weapon, of course. Pretty strong evidence. Now, we've talked about this case at length. I would have expected there to be a lot more DNA than that. And like you said, there's at least DNA from a couple other unidentified males that have to be ruled out. There's going to be a lot of people coming and going, but I think it's very strong evidence. And really one of the two other key pieces, three total pieces of evidence that the state hung its hat on in that probable cause affidavit: the DNA, the cell tower evidence, cell site evidence, and of course the Hyundai Elantra, the video surveillance.
Exactly right. There are a lot of pieces of evidence here that are going to be looked into. Obviously, DNA looked at as one of the most strong pieces that they can have out there. But let's talk about the phone records a little bit. Not only do we have the pinging of the towers and the triangulation that's going on, but something that we really have not heard of yet, which will, I'm sure, come out in the trial, would be the actual data on the phone. What was being texted? What was being looked up? What's in that phone? Are you expecting that we're going to see some pretty strong pieces coming out once this does eventually make it to trial in terms of what data is on that phone?
I do, Tony. And, obviously this case, we're subject to a gag order. So not a whole lot of evidence trickling out since that initial search and arrest warrant, probable cause statement. But there have been some leaks. And one of those leaks are some apparent Instagram direct messages between Kohberger and at least one of the victims. I don't know if those Instagram messages were replied to. Some of the reports were that they were not. But, if you combine that with him apparently going to the restaurant where two of the victims work, you may have some sort of stalking motive here. And look, let's be honest. These were some young women. And I don't know what Bryan Kohberger's interest in them was, but I think that's a good story that, here's some kind of weird, creepy guy who was obsessed with these women, or at least one of the victims, right? And that's the basis for the murder, maybe some jealousy. So I think, obviously, we know motive isn't an element of the crime, something the prosecution needs to prove, but jurors want to hear why. And why would someone do this? And I think that's a good story. And I think that cell phone evidence, what's actually on Kohberger's phone, will be key.
Yeah, that definitely will be. You have the phone evidence, you have DNA evidence. The behavioral evidence also, very interesting. How will that play to the jury when we're talking about some of the information that was out there online, specifically when we're looking at DeSale's project that he was working on, the questions that he was asking of potential criminals to participate, like, why did you choose that victim or target over others? Things that were very specific, creepily specific when you're talking about trying to investigate criminal behavior, especially after committing the crime. What were you thinking or feeling? Almost trying to create his own guidebook, if in fact he is the killer, as to what he should be feeling and what he should be doing in a crime like this. Is that going to play well to the jury?
I think so. I think it is. And, law enforcement is going to have to explain some of Kohberger's behavior, right? why was the cell phone turned off or on airplane mode, right, at the time of the murders? And they're going to say, well, look, someone who's very sophisticated that understands that cell tower, that cell site technology, and wanted to make sure that he was ahead of it. So everything that he did to avoid, capture the DNA, why there's no murder weapon, right? I mean, here's someone that would take steps to dispose of it, why there's so little DNA, all the things that are atypical, and why, frankly, it took law enforcement so long to find this guy, because he was so careful, one of the most careful defendants that we've certainly covered here on the show. And I think that all tells the story of here's someone that understands the criminal mind, but not just that side, also understands law enforcement and the tools and steps that they take to investigate someone. And that's why he was able to elude capture for so long, and why some of the evidence that we would expect to see in the CSI world just isn't there in this case.
Want to listen ad-free? Want advanced access to all of our interviews before anyone else?
Become a True Crime Today Premium Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts.
You get every episode commercial-free,
so you can binge on true crime
until you can binge no more.
Search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts now, or go to our podcast page and sign up now.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast next.